Hello everyone, welcome to today's video where we'll take a look at a very interesting concept in the Rook Endgame called the Saavedra position. So let's take a look at a few examples to understand what it is. So this is the first position, it's white to play, and yet white is forced to play c7. They have to push the pawn because if they try to move the king, let's say if they go king b7, then black can go rook c5 and they can sacrifice the rook for the pawn and that will be a draw. So if you go c7 here, they just go rook takes c7 and that's simply a draw. So that's why we need to push the pawn to c7 here. And after we play c7, black has to stop the pawn from promoting to c8, but they can't really come behind the pawn or they can't go to d8. Both these squares are controlled, which means they have to rely on the checks. So they go with rook d6 check. Now again, it's very important to go king b5 because if we go king b7 here, then they can just go rook d7, pin the pawn, and next move they sacrifice the rook for the pawn, and that's a draw. Instead of this, if we go king c5, that's also a mistake because now black can go rook d1 with the idea of rook c1 check when you promote. If you don't promote and if you move the king, they can simply go rook c1, which stops the pawn. And if you promote, you'll just lose your queen, and then black wins in this case. So that's why the only move here is to go king b5. So you don't allow the black's rook to come anywhere in the c file. You don't allow them to pin the pawn by playing rook d7, and you don't allow them to create the skewer attack by going all the way back. So after king b5, black has to continue with the checks. So they go rook d5 check, king b4, rook d4 check, king b3, and when they go rook d3 check, now you finally go king c2. So now the point is black can't go rook d8, they can't go anywhere on the c file, but they still have one trick left. They can try this move rook to d4. Now the point of this move is they have a stalemate trick in mind. If we promote the pawn to queens here, it would be a huge mistake because now black can go rook c4 check, and now we are forced to take because both the king and the queen are under attack, and when you take with the queen, it's a stalemate. And that is why we don't promote to a queen here. So we do the under promotion where we promote to a rook. And once you promote to a rook, you are threatening rook a8 checkmate. And they can't move the king away. The king is stuck in the corner. So the only way to prevent the checkmate is to play this move, rook to a4. But when they go rook to a4, we have this final winning move, king b3. And after king b3, we are creating two threats. We are attacking the rook as well as threatening rook c1 checkmate, and black can't really stop both. So this is one of the basic positions in the Saavedra position. So we'll try to look at a few more examples to understand this in detail. So this is the next one. It's quite similar, but there's a slight difference here. So now again it's white to play, and just like the previous case, we are forced to push the pawn. Because if you're going to go king e7, if you're going to move the king forward, they always go rook e5 check. And in this case, black can actually win because after rook e5 check, you're forced to go to the f file, and then black's king can come to d7. So black's king is very close, and black can get more than a draw, a win in this case. So this clearly is not an option for white. So they have to push the pawn to f7. And here again, black can't go rook f5, they can't get behind the pawn. They have to rely on the checks. They can't go to the 8th rank as well because black's own king is blocking the path. So black has to go rook c6 check. You go king e5. So they have to keep repeating the same thing. They go rook c5 check, king e4, rook c4 check, king e3, rook c3 check, and you go king f2. And it seems like after rook c2 check here, we cannot really escape the series of checks, but here is where we have a different plan. Now we are going to go to the g file, and we are going to do the same thing. We're just going to go to g7 till we reach the g7 square. Because you notice that the king is placed on c7, which means black's rook cannot go to c7 and pin the pawn when white's king goes to g7. So what it means is, now you go king g3. Now again, black has to rely on the checks. Rook c3 check, king g4, rook c4 check, king g5, rook c5, king g6, and after rook c6, you have this move king g7. And black can't get rook c7, and because of this, it's going to be a win for white. And yeah, so there are no ways to go to f6, or there's no check, or there's no way to pin the pawn, and that's why this is completely winning for white. So let's take a look at one more position in the Saavedra. So this is white to play. It's slightly more complex compared to the previous two positions. So here the only winning move for white is to take the pawn on e6. Now here one more choice, which is to take the pawn on f6, but of course that's simply a draw, because if you're going to go knight f6, black can go rook c1 check first. They can exchange the rooks like this, rook h1, and then they can simply take the pawn. And this is a draw due to lack of material. So which means we have to take, and more like d6 would never work, because again they could just give a check, exchange the rooks, and then go king c6, and the pawn is lost. So you have to take the pawn on e6. Now black tries the same thing, because if they try to, let's say if they try to bring their king close to the pawn with something like king c7, then you can go knight f8, and next, the rook is coming in, you can just push the pawn next, and it's really hard to stop the pawn. So this clearly doesn't work. So the only chance for black here is to, try to give this check on c1, and the idea here is, if you go king g2, it's a draw, because after king g2, black can exchange the rooks. You have to take, because you can't really go e7 here, because black simply has to move rook e1, and next they can just win the pawn. So you go king takes h1, now comes king c7. So they could go king c7 or king c6, both aimed at bringing the king closer to the pawn. And if you're going to take the f6 pawn, you just go king d6, and you can't save the pawn. You could try to protect the pawn with this move knight to f8, but that doesn't work, because black could go king d6 with the threat of king e7 next. Let's say you go king g2, there's king e7. So if you move the knight, you lose the pawn. But you could also try to bring your king close to the f6 pawn to win it. You could go king f3, king takes f8, king f4. King e7, I attack the pawn. White goes king f5. And now, very important, the only move here is king e8. Now the point of this move is, whenever white takes a pawn on f6, you need to make sure that you get the opposition. And to do that, you need to play king e8 here. And we know that the king is not ahead of the pawn, which means this is always a draw. So white takes on f6, and then you go king f8, and this is just a draw. So that is why king g2 here doesn't work. Then what about king e2? King e2 also doesn't work, because after rook takes h1, you go e7, and so you might think that you're about to promote the pawn, but here black has this really nice resource rook h5 with the idea of rook e5. So you can't really stop rook e5. Whatever you promote a queen, or you promote a rook, black goes rook e5 check, and then they just exchange the queen, and this is a draw. So king e2 also doesn't work. So the only other option left is king f2, which is the only winning move for white. So we'll try to understand what's happening here. So after king f2, black has to of course take the rook, and now you go e7. And now the difference is, so there's no rook e1 first of all, so they can't stop the pawn from behind. There's no rook h5. The previous idea which they tried, it doesn't work, because after e8 queens, rook e5 doesn't come with a check, which means black has to try the checks. So they go rook h2 check, and here we push the king forward, king f3. So they have to continue the same sequence. Rook h3 check, king goes to f4, rook h4 check, king f5, rook h5 check, king f6. And then they go rook h6 check. So at this point you can't go king f7, because if you go king f7, there's just rook takes h7 check, and then eventually they sacrifice the rook for the pawn, which means you have to come back. So what we have done here is we have won the f6 pawn. That's the major difference. So you come back to f5, black has to again follow the same, they give a check, king f4, rook h4, king f3, rook h3, and now you go king e2, rook h2. So now again it seems like there's no escaping these checks, but we have an idea. So we go forward, but this time we take the d file, not the f file. So we go king d3, rook h3, king d4, rook h4, king d5, rook h5, king d6. And now black has two options. One is they could go rook h6. They could also try this option of rook h1. Point of rook h1 is next they're going to give a check on d1, force the king to the e file, and then again going to give a check on e file, and then they're going to just win the piece which you have promoted. So for instance, if you're going to promote to a queen or a rook here, it's a draw because they go rook d1 check, king is forced to the e file, and then they again give a check, and eventually they win the queen, and it's a draw. But here we do have a winning sequence, which is knight f6. And after knight f6, you're threatening e8 queens, because now if they go rook e1, there is knight d7 check, and after the king moves, you just have knight d5. So you just close the line between the pawn and the rook, and now if black goes rook d1 check, which is the only check left, you simply go king e6, and there's no way to stop the pawn. Instead of rook e1, if they try rook d1 check, then there's knight d5. Very important to note that knight d5 comes with a check, so black really doesn't have the time to go back to e1 with the rook. So that's why rook h1 doesn't work. So the next option is to go rook h6. But if they go rook h6, here white has a very strong move, knight to f6, sacrificing the knight. So here they can take the knight, or they could go rook h8. They have two options. If they're going to go rook h8, you simply have knight d7 check, and wherever the king goes, you just again close the line with knight f8. And if they again give a check, you simply go king d7, and you notice that they can't go rook h7 and pin the pawn. They can't go behind the pawn on the e file, and rook h8 also doesn't work because the knight on f8 just closes the line, so e8 queens will happen. So rook h8 is not working. And if they try rook takes f6, now you again come back from where you came, king d5, rook f5 check, king d4, rook f4 check, king d3, rook f3, and after king e2, this is winning because again there's no way to stop the pawn. So these are the few examples. So this is the next position which I would like you to try and solve, and once you solve it, do comment down the answer, and then we'll try to analyze this particular position in a different video. I hope you understood the Saavedra position, and if you do like the video, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you. We'll see you next time with a better video.